So many times before, my microphone was just off, so I said all of that on camera and it didn't record. But we're recording now. Everything seems to be good. We've gone into Photoshop. We've done file new. We made 800 by 480, transparent, 8-bit, all the fun stuff. We have something that looks like this. We're looking for the gradient tool. Now, the gradient tool, it normally hides under the paint bucket. But if yours already looks like this, then you already have the gradient tool. What I want to do, I'm just going to open the tool. And if you look up here, this is the color of your gradient. And this matches the foreground and the background color. So if I switch my foreground and my background, it switches my gradient. And if I turn my foreground and background to black and white, it changes my gradient to black and white. Do you see this? So we have foreground color black, background color white. It's a gradient from black to white. In order to apply the gradient, all you're going to do first, make a new layer. And you're just going to click and drag. Scary when it does that. Every gradient, just left mouse click and drag it over here.
Okay. How did you get it to go in color? Mine is just, I have red and black, but the gradient says it's gonna be white and black.
I don't know. It's just testing. It's okay. No threads. So yours doesn't have any color associated with it? Okay. So if I change these colors, right? If I change this to red, then I change this to black. Oh, my gradient color was using the colors down there, but now it's not. Weird. That's okay. To open up your color gradient, basics. Yeah, that's fine, I guess. You have a lot of options to choose from. But I would like to edit the gradient. And it used to be you just double clicked on the gradient and then you could change the colors. But now you have all these presets. I don't like that. Pause. Can't have you all saying you're not recording after I've talked for 20 minutes. All right, so you have this gradient drop down right here. If you drop it down and say classic gradient, this is how the gradient tool has looked for the past 15 years. Apparently they updated it. Yes.
It's not talking about. Well, I'm not saying the bottom to the red and black first.
May I interrupt?
I suppose you already have.
Are we being rude?
It's too late. Tell me what you need. Let me wait, hold on. We may not want this on recording.
No, you can have it on recording, it's not bad. Caleb's just the type.
I got it. I'm recording. Once you don't have a gradient on your screen, drop down to the classic gradient. Classic gradient is the one I'm familiar with. Again, this is the one that Photoshop has had for the past 15 years. I don't know why they just changed it to the new gradient. There's some cool new feature that I'm not aware of in the new gradient, but let's go with classic gradient. That allows you to double click on your little color swatch here. And it brings up your presets as well, but also this color chooser right here. Now, the color chooser, you have a few different features. You have this dot on the top. Whoops, come back, dot on the top. This is your opacity. This is how strong your color is or whether you can see through it. If it's at 100%, then it's 100% color. If it happened to be at, I don't know, 10%, then you see how everything kind of fades to this transparency look. So you can click on the individual dots, and I'm going to make mine back to 100% opacity. So the dots on the top are just about opacity. That's it. The dots on the bottom are the ones that determine the color. So we want to pick for our metal. What color is metal? Silver, gray-ish, right? So we're going to double click on our color picker and we're going to find a gray, silver, gray color. Fancy. Looks like this, maybe. Great. We're going to apply the same color to the dot at the end by double clicking and choosing the color. Double click on the dot. It brings up your color picker. If you use only web colors, that makes it really, really easy to find the same color because there's only like 256 colors available instead of what, I don't know, 10 million something. So for my sake, I like the web colors. Now, right now we don't have a gradient. All we have is solid gray to solid gray, yeah? That's not much of a gradient. If you want to add more colors, you just click on the bottom, in this bottom space, you see where your mouse changes to a finger? If you click down there, it puts in a new dot. Now, by default, the location you put it at is wherever the location is, but we want the location of this to be at 50. So you can think of it as like a percentage from 0 all the way to 100. And then this dot is at 50. Now we still just have solid gray, and that's okay with me. We want 2 more dots. We want a dot at 25 and we want a dot at 75. So we click and then we click. And we make sure the locations are at 25 and 75. Not super important that it's exact, but sometimes it is. So you want to make sure you know how to manipulate the location of your colors in the gradient editor. So now what I want to do is double click on one of my new middle dots. And I'm just going to choose a lighter gray color, just a little bit lighter on both of them. Once you have the dot down, you should be able just to double click on it. And it'll bring up your color picker. And you're going to pick a lighter color gray.
I clicked off of it.
Okay. Now, you do have 2 monitors. One thing that could happen at some point is your color picker is open, but it's on your other monitor, and you're not looking at it. When the color picker is open, you can't do anything else. You have to either pick a color or close it. So my color picker is open, and you'll notice I can't really even move stuff around, right? I can't change my tool. Apparently I could change the sampling here, but I can't change anything. And that's because my color picker is open. Also, what has happened in the past is somehow my Photoshop gets in front of my color picker. And my color picker is in the background, and then I can't touch it. That's hard. You have to, I can't do it right now, but you have to change your view. Sometimes go back to a default view or window, turn your color picker on wherever it is. It sucks, but usually that doesn't happen. Usually the problem is it's just off the screen. Look to your other screen, bring it back, choose your color, and then you can go back to working. So we have our gradient color chosen. Now I have a lot of different gradient techniques up here. There's just a gradient left to right. There's a circular gradient. I'm just going to show you all of them. Left to right looks like this. A circular gradient looks like this. There's a rotational gradient. Well, that's not. It looks weird because of the colors that we've chosen. But it starts and like goes around kind of counterclockwise through all the colors that you have. This one doesn't work as well because of the colors we chose, but that's what it does. You have a vertical, and then you have a diamond type. We're just going to use the regular first one from left to right, classic gradient. And we are going to draw, go ahead.
I think I need help, something,
Okay.
it's not doing,
It's not letting you draw the gradient.
no, it's not like shading it right, like, it's not like making the correct pattern for some reason. Not like that, no, it doesn't look like that.
So to make it right, you need to hold down shift on your keyboard, click just on the left side of your window, and drag all the way just to the right side
Yeah,
of your
I did
window,
that.
right? And if it's not looking correct, I'm going to come look at it and figure out why. But you could get effects that look something like this if your line's not long enough, but you want your line to be all the way across. Now, this is something else that's frustrating with the gradient tool, is it always overwrites whatever you already had down there, right? So let's say I really liked this, but I messed up. The only way to do it is to go back. You can't delete anything. It just overwrites it all. I'm going to pause, fix the problems, and we'll come back. Let's say somehow you've messed up your gradient, right? And it just doesn't look like you want it to. It's not smooth. It's not, there's no actual gradient, whatever. You've done something, you've messed it up. The gradient tool is really forgiving in the sense that you can just grab your color and drag it down, and it gets rid of it. And then you have your two gray colors, and you can just start over and change your color, middle one to dark, and the other two are lighter gray. But the important thing is that these are always flexible. You can move them around, and we're going to talk a little bit more, I guess. Oh no, come back. Every time you click on a color, you'll see these two dots. Beside of it, diamonds, I guess. What these diamonds represent is how quickly you want to transition from the color over here all the way to the color over here. If you drag it all the way to the right, then it's almost going to be entirely your left color. If you drag it all the way to the left, it's entirely your right color. But when you put it somewhere in the middle, or as close to the middle as you can, then you get that consistent fade from dark to light. You don't always want that. In this case, we do. But every single color point that you put in has that flexibility to do on both sides. And additionally, your opacity has that ability. So I could put a new opacity point in the middle and name it, put it at 10%. Oh, come back. And then I could change the opacity percentage, I guess. But if you don't like that, you just click it and drag it up and it goes away. So we should have a really cool gradient on here. Yes? Yes. Yay. All right. We're going to add a new layer on top of this. It's a transparent layer, so there's nothing on it right now. But we want to fill this layer with a solid color. So there's two ways to do that. The first way is to create the layer, use the paint bucket tool, and then go and grab your color, which is just this light gray that we want here. And then you click the paint bucket and it fills the whole thing. If you don't create a new layer and you try to use the paint bucket, it's not going to do it quite like you want, right? But I guess now's a good time to talk about the paint bucket since we have it open. Your paint bucket has an opacity, it has a color, and it also has a tolerance. What tolerance means is there are I don't know, however many different shades of color there are, right? The tolerance is how many shades away from the pixel that you click on that it's willing to color with the paint bucket. So right now my tolerance is 32. If I click in this light gray, it goes out to a darker gray, but not super dark. If I turn my tolerance down to like 5, then it's only picking colors that are much closer to the pixel that I chose. And if I change my tolerance to 75, then it's picking a much wider range of pixels. In this case, it's all of them.
Same layer or make a new one?
If you're doing it on the same layer, this is what you're going to get. But I want you to make a new layer and paint it this solid color gray.
Okay.
But there's also a contiguous button. So normally I click and it just paints all the ones that it can touch. If I turn contiguous off, then it's going to paint all of those colors everywhere on my map or on my canvas, right? So there's a lot of different applications for it, but right now I want to make a new layer, and then on that layer I can paint it this solid light gray color. Now, if you don't want to do it that way, if you don't want to use the paint bucket, you can come down to this little half moon button down here, and you can make a solid color as a new layer and then choose the color you want. It's going to look exactly the same, right? It's a little different. It's easier for me just to make a new layer and then paint it with this gray color. Now, when we're creating textures, a lot of times what we need in order to actually make something is just a little bit of, it's harder to find a better word than texture, right? Like a solid gray mat doesn't look like anything. You can't do anything to it. So we need to get some more visual discrepancy in there so that we can actually have something to work with. So the first thing we're going to do is come up to filter, come down to noise, and we are going to add noise. It looks like static. We're going to use monochromatic because we don't want a whole bunch of rainbow colors in our metal. We're going to use uniform, and we're going to turn the amount pretty much all the way up to 400%. So it gives us these black and white features, right?
Like one of the TVs you call that blue and white is going shit.
Yeah. This is noise, right? We always called that noise. This is the visual representation of white noise. So now we have a little bit of discrepancy on our layer that we can work with. We can do something to this. What we want to do is go to filter and blur and do a motion blur. And you'll see as you go through, all the motion blur makes it look like is like you just took this image, right, and just drug it across and made it, left it where whatever you came up with. The further you drag it, the more it looks distorted. If you don't drag it much, it just looks a little bit blurry, hence motion blur. We want to drag it about 40 pixels. We want to get a really distinct blur. Really distinct blur here, and then just say okay. Yeah. All right. So the next thing we want to do, we have this noise layer. It's got these really strong edges. So I'm going to hit Control T on my keyboard. And I just want to scale it up until those really sharp edges aren't there anymore so that the whole thing is blurry. If you hold down Alt on your keyboard when you're scaling, it will scale from the center instead of from one side. So by default, it's going to start off looking like this. When you hit Control T, it's going to bring up these 8 dots. You can grab any dot and drag it and it changes the shape. But if you hold down Alt, it shapes it from the middle instead of from the single location you clicked. And all I want to do is just drag it up just a little bit to get rid of those 2 really sharp edges. All right, pretty straightforward. The last thing we want to do, we have this textured effect, right? But we just want to add some of the shading detail to it. So we're going to change our blending mode. So when we talk about blending mode, there is a quick blending mode feature right here on our layers menu. But it's easier just to double click on the layer and that brings up your layer styles. You have blending options and we want to change our blend mode to overlay. So we're going to talk a little bit about what all these different blending modes do. Because we're learning Photoshop as much as we're learning how to make this really simple, boring texture, right? So, overlay, what it does is it takes the top layer. Okay. So the top layer we have is just this motion blurred noise layer, right? Doesn't have a whole lot of detail on it. But when we use an overlay to the layer below it, it pulls some of the color value from the layer below it and brings it into our top texture. Now this is good because this is a non-destructive edit. We haven't actually done anything to affect our primary texture that we had created. All we've done is change the way the lighting interacts with it. Non-destructive editing gives you the ability to make a really cool texture that you like, a brick wall, a metal grate. But you can use that texture in a lot of different environments because you're changing the way the lighting affects it. Does that make sense? So that's a simple overlay. There's also a darken, which you see what it does. Multiply takes everything, all the individual color values, and multiplies them together so that you get generally a darker version, but it keeps most of the detail. Color burn pulls the color out and really emphasizes the contrast. But all of these do something different. The only ones that I really use very often are overlay and then soft light. They do kind of similar things. Every once in a while, I'll use a color overlay, which isn't really helpful right now because the 2 colors are pretty much the same. If you wanted to, you could use a dissolve overlay. and then as you turn that down, you get more of a pixelated effect. This is really just a way to make your own noise if you wanted to. We'll use the overlay, and that'll bring the light through to our cool metal design. Yay! Easy. Brushed metal is easy, right? You could put this on something and it would look okay. It look kind of metally if it was in the background, right? We want to add more to it than that. So we're going to take a quick 10-minute break, and we're going to come back and add more detail to our metal texture. Cool? We're going to make a pattern. We're going to go to File, New, and we're going to make this 48 by 48. Not going to be too small. Let's make it 96 by 96. Be a little bit bigger. So 96 by 96, and then hit Create. And now you have this new layer, or this new file that you're working with, and we're only using this square to make our patterned texture. How so? Yeah, you're good. You're good.
Okay, well, I made this a little bit long. You said 96 by 96, right?
Yeah. File, New, 96 by 96.
Like this?
If you could, if you hold down the Alt key and then scroll up on the scroll wheel.
Yeah. So if you need to see it bigger, which you do, hold down Alt on your keyboard, and then you can use your mouse wheel. What's really cool about Photoshop is if you just use your mouse wheel, you scroll up and down. If you hold Alt on the keyboard, you zoom in and out. And if you hold Control on the keyboard, you scroll left to right. Just some navigational information, I guess. All right. I think I still have a transparent background here. Do I want that? I'm going to keep that. What I want to do next is I want to create sort of a diamond pattern. What we're going for is we're not going to make this quite as intense, but we want kind of this idea, right? Like a graded metal that you're kind of walking on has these raised diamond patterns for texture, for safety, right? So we're going to try to make something like this. We're not going to get the rust. We might get to the rust, but probably not today. So what I want is I just want to make one of these diamond textures, or one of these diamond shapes. So there's a lot of ways to do that. You could grab a brush. You could pick your round brush, and you can make it really small, and you can come in and actually paint your diamond. Paint your diamond shape and color it in. You could do that, right? I don't want to do that. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to pick a size of maybe 30. Yeah, 30 looks good. And then I'm going to change it so that it is squashed by over here on the brush editor. So remember when we press F5, we have a whole bunch of options for our brush tip shape and everything. If you don't push F5 and you're just over on the brush tool, you still have a little bit of information, a few options to choose your brush shape. So again, I'm going to set my size to about 30, and then I'm going to squash my shape. And then if you grab the arrow, you can angle it 45 degrees or whatever. I'm going to angle mine 45 degrees. So I get something that looks like this. Now I want this to be exactly in the middle of my layer. So do you have rulers on your Photoshop? No. So to get rulers, we're going to come up to View. And there's a little check mark beside rulers. We're just going to make sure that that check mark is on. Okay. So with the rulers, if you click and drag, you can create guides, usually light blue guides on your on your design. And if you drag them close to the middle, you'll notice that it kind of snaps to the middle. Now remember, we made this 96 by 96, so where should the middle be? What's half of 96? 48. So you can drag it to the middle and it'll snap to 48, and then drag it from the top to the middle and it will snap to 48. So to get the rulers, you'll go to View and just make sure your little ruler's check mark is on.
It is, but it's not popping up.
You should have a ruler up top. Really small ruler.
Right here.
Yeah. And then one on the side. And by default, I think these are measured in pixels, which is good for what we want. So then you just click and drag from the top all the way down until it snaps to the 48. Click on the left and drag it all the way over until it snaps to the 48. Now, if you need something more than just right in the center, right? Let's say you needed something at 25%. What's half of 48?
24.
24. So you would be trying to place this at 24, but you'll notice it doesn't snap, right? So it's kind of hard to get it to exactly 24. If you come back up to View, and then come back down to Guides, then you can create a new guide. And you tell it that you want it to be a vertical guide at 25%. And if you type 25%, then it automatically is going to put that guide in. In this case, it's at 24 pixels. You can do the same thing, guides, new guide at 75%. If you know the pixel, you could also just put in the number of pixels, right? But 75%, you can change the color of your guides. So I can make this one black. It's a little bit more visible, right? But I don't need them at the 25% marks. So I'm just going to undo that because I only want the middle. Now, when we're making a brush or a pattern, what color should it be? Always grayscale. So I'm going to choose a black brush. And I'm just going to click kind of in the middle. And try and get my first diamond shape. I don't think that looks big enough. So I'm going to turn this up to maybe, that looks too big. Let's do 44. Good enough. Is that good enough? It's good enough. We could do a little bit of work making the corners a little bit harder if we wanted to. I don't want to, so I'm not going to. I lied maybe a little. Good enough. All right. So now we want to talk about the idea of tiling. It's okay. You don't have that diamond shape?
I'm using my screw.
Yeah, that's what mine is too.
So some people are painting with their brush that we made in the last class, your screw, right? That's not what we want. You want to drop down and make sure you're using just a regular hard round brush. And once you click on that brush, you'll set the size. I think I set mine to, what did I say, 44. And then you can squish it and then rotate it 45 degrees. Ish. If you wanted it to be exact, you could hit F5 and then you could set it to 45 degrees exactly. But it's not that important to me. I was pretty close on my guess though, right? All right. So now we have to worry about making sure that this is going to tile. And if you look at our original image again that we're trying to recreate, you notice that the diamonds are at 90-degree angles to one another, right? And they just tile like that. So what we really need is something that starts about halfway through this one, this diamond, and then goes halfway around all the 4 diamonds around it. Does that make sense? Because we need our upper right corner to match our lower left corner. Does that make sense? If it doesn't, we're just going to do it. So we have one layer. I am going to duplicate this layer. I'm going to name it upper right. Because I've named it upper right, I'm going to drag this guy all the way up until he snaps. So Photoshop again does a really good job of guessing where you want things to be exactly. I'm going to move it up to the upper right corner so that it snaps into that corner. I'm going to duplicate the layer again. We're going to do this a few times. I'm going to call this one lower right. And I'm going to move it down to the lower right section until it snaps. We'll get something that looks like this. Rinse and repeat, duplicate layer, lower left. We're going to use our move tool. We're going to drag it down until it snaps, which it will. And then one more time, duplicate layer, upper left. And we're going to move it up until it snaps. So now our texture should be tileable once we get all of this together. I'm going to pause it and give you all a chance to catch up. Bless you. So now what we've got, since we've duplicated this layer to the lower right, upper left, and lower left, we now have a texture that is tileable. And that means as long as we don't go over to the edges, right, whatever we put on this texture will tile across our design, right? Because our corners are connected. As long as we don't mess up these interior points here, we'll have a tileable texture, which is what we want, right? But we need the diamonds to be at 90-degree angles. So with our first layer selected, I'm going to come up to Edit, and I'm going to come to Transform. And we are going to rotate 90 degrees clockwise.
Oh, can you go back, rotate that?
Yep.
Form and hit rotate.
So we select the layer that we're working on, which is our first layer. We come up to Edit, come all the way down to Transform, and then down to Rotate 90 degrees clockwise. Technically, 90 degrees counterclockwise does the exact same thing. And that's going to give us this effect where we have our diamonds and they are perpendicular to one another. Now, there may be too much spacing between them. I don't know, but we're going to give it a shot. So we have our diamond. Next thing we're going to do is we want to flatten this image. We want to put all of this together onto one layer. There's a couple of ways to do that. One way is to make a new layer and bring all this onto it, but I don't care about saving the original content of the document. So I'm just going to select all of the layers, right click, and say flatten image. If you don't select them all, if you just right click and say flatten image, it will still work. You right click on the layer itself and then flatten image. I think I messed up. We're going to undo that because we don't want a background. We want it to be transparent, right? So I'm going to make a new layer underneath my layer 1. I'm going to call this layer background. By default, my background layer is transparent, and that is fine with me. Now I'm going to click on layer 1, and I'm going to hold down Shift, and then click on my top layer. For me, it's called upper right. For you, it may be something different. It doesn't matter as long as you end up selecting all 5 layers. And then with all 5 layers selected, right click and say merge layers. If you wanted a hotkey, it's Control E, but I never use the hotkey for this. I'm just not that confident in my ability to have selected the layers properly. Merge layers. So now I have one layer with my tile style on it and one background layer which maintains everything's transparency. Now I want to hit Control A on my keyboard. What Control A does is it just selects everything. Selects all. Control A just selects everything, the whole canvas that I'm working with. And then we've done this part before. We come up to Edit and Define Pattern. And we are just going to call this Metal Diamonds. Edit, Define Pattern, and then give it a name. Now we're going to come back to our original metal texture, just the brushed metal. We're going to make a new layer. And we want to fill our layer with our new pattern. So we're going to use the pattern stamp tool, which is housed over here right underneath our brush tool and hidden kind of behind the clone stamp. You'll see a pattern stamp because it has a little checkerboard in the upper left. The clone stamp, if you click it and hold it down or right click on it, then you'll see the pattern stamp tool hidden behind the clone stamp tool. Then you need to come up to the middle and change your pattern to be your little diamond shapes. And then you can just brush over your entire new layer with your diamond shapes. So again, even if yours isn't perfect, the idea is there, you could make a better pattern, right? But for the sake of demonstration, what we want to do is just look at the layer styles that come with Photoshop. So in order to bring up the layer style, we want to double click on our layer. Alternatively, we could right click and come up to blending options. But for me, I just like to double click. Okay. So what we're going to try and do with our Photoshop tool is give some depth to our tiled pattern so that it looks like we have brushed metal with these raised diamond structures that we see a lot of different locations, right? You're familiar with this visual. First thing we're going to do is come to the bevel and emboss. And if you want, you can move your layer style over to the side so you can still kind of see your image. You don't have to, but generally, if this is something that you're trying to create, you want to be able to see your image at least a little bit because you're not following a tutorial, right? You're going to be trying to blend it and see if it looks good. You want to be able to see your actual art. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is set the style to inner bevel. We're going to set it to chisel hard. We're going to set the depth way up. And that's giving us this kind of pointed shape on our diamonds, right? If we go way down, right, then it's not as strong, but it's probably good enough for what we've got. And we also want to make the size really big. Maybe 100, 105, somewhere around in there. But we don't want to soften it at all. So this is giving us a really, really chiseled shape, right, to our diamond to make them look like they're raised up. Now you can change around your shading to see which one looks best. It's not super important exactly which one you go with. But you want a little bit of altitude and a little bit of angle. That's kind of it. If you, mine is set at 72 and 16, but again, that's not super important. It's just showing you, that's just going to give you where the lighting is coming from. So now we need to talk about these gloss contours. For the most part, our gloss contours are going to be linear. There are other options, and you can click through them to see if you like the way one of them looks better than the linear one. Usually I don't. So I end up going with this straight line here. And anti-alias doesn't really do a whole lot of anything. So I'll leave it off. And then with the highlight mode, by default, it's set to screen. And the opacity is around 50%, I think. But that doesn't do a whole lot. If you turn it up, you get a little bit more of a highlight in your texture. It just makes, it's like the lighting is just a little bit stronger. But you can also change the color of the lighting, right? Like let's say you were putting this in an area that had kind of a blue tinted light. Right, you could do that. You could set that blue tint on your texture, and it would just feel like it belonged in that space a little bit better. I don't have blue light, so I'm going to turn this back to white. And I'm just going to turn it up a little bit so that I get that highlight. So we've come pretty far. We have our base brushed metal. We have this texture over it, but we want to make it just a little bit more detailed. So the next thing we're going to add is a drop shadow. And remember, in the layer styles, if you just click on the checkbox, that will turn it on, but it won't bring up the editing features for it. You want to click on the actual word, and that will bring you up to the actual features that you can edit. So with it turned on, you're still using global light. You could change that if you wanted, right? But I'm probably not going to. You want your distance. You see if you set it really, really high, it's going to look weird, right? You want it to be a really small distance, just enough to show that there is obviously light coming in from the upper right, but you're creating a shadow on the left side, right? Because that's what would happen if light was coming in from the right, you'd have a shadow on the left. The sharper it is, usually the brighter the light. So you don't want to have a super sharpness. You set your spread to maybe around 20%. That gives it kind of a little bit of a blur. And then you could make it huge, which isn't really noticeable. Or you could just kind of make it a little bit visible, maybe 5, 6, 7, somewhere around in there. All right. Pretty good start. Say okay. And now you have this kind of metal grate texture that you could apply maybe to a floor, maybe to a wall, I don't know, somewhere, right? If you don't like the way your diamonds look, you could scale them, right? You can make them smaller, and then have more of a pattern. But again, the idea is that you draw them at the size you want them to be in your pattern, and then you just apply them to the texture, right? If you're doing a lot of scaling with your tiled texture, then you probably didn't make it the size you wanted it to. So there you go. Metal, tile, tileable. This may not be tileable actually beyond this, but your tile pattern worked. Somebody's beating up my drink machine. They're really giving it the business too.
No, it's a vending machine.
What did I say?
It's
Oh,
a drink machine.
vending the other machine.